What is up, everybody, and welcome to the Small Lake City podcast. I am your host, Eric Nilsson, and welcome back for episode 2. Thank you so much for listening to episode 1, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Today, we are going to be covering a pretty different topic, but I think it's one that is near and dear to most people's hearts in the Salt Lake Valley. And I think if we were to ask everyone across the valley if they had one issue that they could wave their wand and fix, it would be one of the top answers. And you might be thinking about it already, but it is the air quality in Utah. For those that have been here for a little bit of time, you've probably seen it slowly get worse. You've seen a lot more national attention with the Great Salt Lake drying up and the threat of heavy metals entering our air and becoming a much less safe and harmful place to live. So today we're going to be talking to David Garbet, who is the founder of the nonprofit O2 Utah, which is a nonprofit geared towards getting legislation passed to fight air quality and climate change in Utah. So excited to share this with you all and hear about some of the solutions towards these problems, because sometimes it feels like traction isn't being made or these issues are getting ignored. So join in and hear some of his commentary on what he is doing to make this city a better place to live. Enjoy.
Hey, Eric. Great to be here.
Hey, thanks for coming. I'm so excited for this one because obviously the point is to talk to people in a broad aspect of things. I mean, we've covered everything from entertainment to entrepreneurs to, almost love stories. And now I really want to touch this in environmental piece because it's so relevant to other people. But I kind of want to start with from the beginning and hear how you came to love such a beautiful place and kind of the foundation that was built there. So, born and raised in Salt Lake, what part of the valley were you raised in? What was your family like?
Born and raised here in the valley. As you know, distinction between Salt Lake City and everything else. I grew up in, about half my childhood was in West Valley and then half in Sandy. Went to high school there in Sandy. And I've been away and back a few different times, but keep getting drawn back here to the valley, specifically to Salt Lake City. So yeah, most of my life here.
One thing I know about you is that you're a huge BYU football fan. And would do almost anything to get football tickets. If I remember correctly, that you had a bet with your mother to get season tickets.
Yeah, as always, I feel like I have to, first of all, thank you for disclosing my childhood addiction that I haven't been able to overcome. And then second of all, yes, I feel like I need to explain this to everybody. Look, when I was a kid, my best friend living next door was a big BYU fan, so I became a BYU fan. And at one point, I think when I was 11, my mom told me that if I practiced the piano for a year without missing a day, she would buy season tickets for me for football. And of course, that sounded incredible. So I practiced every single day for a year, except for one. Oof. And my mom said, maybe next year. So then I had to practice that whole second year, finally earn those tickets, and I maintained those for years. But the thing is, you can't just walk away from love like that.
No.
Even if you try, and I have tried. Trust me, I have tried. But, at this point, what are you going to do?
Hey, I'm always...
BYU fan, yes.
Hey,
BYU
we'll take
fan.
It. No one's perfect. But, no, I love that. I love that your mom's like, well, we said 365, you did 364, so the clock starts over again.
Yeah, exactly. And the other question people always ask is like, oh, so you must be really good at piano. It's like, no, it's not like that was quality practicing. I was just sitting on the bench, plinking the keys with one finger. This is, it was all about earning the tickets, not becoming a great musician.
Check the box.
Yeah, exactly.
Love that. So I know you come from a big family. Remind me how many and where you fall within them?
I am the oldest of 8 kids.
The wisest of 8 kids.
Yeah, sure.
And I'm lucky enough to have met a couple of them, and it's so fun to see you guys. You have a really fun dynamic and get along really well. Which sibling would you say you're closest with, and what brings you guys together the most?
We're all pretty close,
True.
Actually. I feel like I've got relationships with all of my siblings. Half of them are here in Utah. The other half are outside. So obviously those that are here I see a bit more, but no, I feel really lucky. And we're all close. We still do things together, spend time together. We'll do vacations, hang out. So I feel like got relationships with all of them.
Nice. And then, I mean, any sort of activities, hobbies that populated your youth outside of piano and BYU addiction, any sports, any
Yeah,
stuff?
I mean, growing up, I did a mix of sports, soccer, basketball, loved sports. In part in this, when we get to this, when I was a kid, I had this issue that affected my knees. And so eventually started interfering with sports, and I couldn't play for a while, team sports, and had to find some other things to do that didn't bother my knees as much. And that's part of the way that I started to get into outdoor activities, which is how I was really introduced to some of these incredible landscapes that we have here in Utah, and that piqued my interest in environmental issues, spending time out in these places, and has had so much to do with most of my career path.
What were some of those first things that drew you out there? Were you mostly just like kind of hiking around, I mean, biking? What was some of those first activities? And I imagine you started pretty close in the valley and then expanded from there.
So the two first activities were really when I was 12, my dad took us backpacking for the first time. And before that, I mean, the time that we spent outdoors was basically the 4th of July and the 24th of July. Our extended family would do a picnic up in Big Cottonwood Canyon, and that was kind of it. We didn't camp, we didn't do much outdoors, and my dad wanted to do something to change that. His sister was a big backpacker, so he invited her to come over and take us backpacking. We actually went down to southern Utah. We were down in what is now Bears Ears National Monument, and yeah, I was just totally blown away by the landscape, didn't know that those kind of places existed, had so much fun doing that. That was my kind of initial introduction to the outdoors. And from that, started doing other things like hiking closer to home. Shortly afterwards, started skiing, resort skiing, which then later on became one of my...
So your family didn't ski much growing up? It was your own initiative?
No, in fact, when I was 13, watching the Winter Olympics, turned to my dad and said, "How come you never take us to do this?" And he thought it would be like a one-time thing. He'd take me and get it out of my system, because he had never seen him go skiing, even though he did some in high school and college. Started at 13, and yeah, loved it from the beginning.
Yeah, I feel like it's hard to love Utah in its entirety unless you can ski or enjoy winters to some extent. But then at the same time, as I go through my head, there's no way to love a Utah winter unless you're on a mountain, tend to using gravity to go down it. Mm-hmm. So that's fun, because I was always take that for granted, because I mean, growing up, it was always like Saturday mornings, Grandpa will be here with the truck at 7. We will load up, we will go. There will be Gatorades and candy in the back. We will go there. We usually snowbird. I mean, we started at Brighton, then snowbird, and then as he got older, went to Snow Basin because it was better for him. But we would always go to Pier 49, the sourdough pizza place at Snowbird every single time, get the same pizzas. It would be me and my cousins, and then we would come back, and it was just such a core memory that I take for granted, because a lot of people didn't get to have that.
Yeah.
But then like on the other side of the coin, because I was raised in a primarily like single parent households where my mother was working a lot, and even before then, before my parents split up, like there was, so much going on that there was no me like, hey, we got some family time. Let's go hike. Let's go camp. Let's go do this. I mean, and I think it's a similar situation you talked about, where we had this one camping trip every year that we would go up into the high Uintas by Chapita Lake. We go fish at the same lakes, do the same hikes, do the same, like granted it was great. Like it was me, my cousins, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, and such a good experience. But at the same time, like I remember when I first kind of moved back to Utah after moving away, I was up in the avenues and I was like walking around, just like hiking in the foothills, like around the Dry Creek and up around there. I'm like, how did I never do this? Because I lived on North Cliff Drive.
Right there.
Like I was right there. Like all I had to do was literally start walking for like 300 feet and I'd probably find a trailhead. And it wasn't until, the TLDR is like, did van life, saw all these other beautiful places in the U.S. and was absolutely floored. And then all of a sudden I come back to Salt Lake and I'm like, this is so much easier. It's so accessible. It's all right here. Then it's like the diversity and all of that, such a fun thing. So now I have this like huge checklist of things that I want to do, not only in Salt Lake, but in Utah, which is great because there's so much to experience. But at the same time, like the list is so daunting that it's a little overwhelming. So So I'm jealous that you were able to find that in an early age and like find that passion that, I mean, eventually drove you to do kind of what you're doing today. And so I know that you left Utah for a period of time. I mean, where all did you go, and what were some of those like tidbits you took away from those experiences?
Yeah, my first foray out of Utah was my Mormon mission to the Dominican Republic when I was 19. I was away for 2 years, came back, finished college here, went away again to the Northeast, to Boston for law school. Came back because I wanted, at that point, the reason I did law school is I had wanted to work as an attorney specifically for the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, working on protecting our incredible public lands.
And that's such a specific thing to do. I'm like so impressed that you're like, okay, so I'm going to go to law school and I'm going to do this specific role at this specific place. I mean, what got you to, or what was it about that organization that drove you to it so specifically?
I mean, I told you that I had that introductory backpacking trip when I was 12 in what is now what is now Bears Ears National Monument. And kind of from there started paying attention to these debates and discussions that were always in the news about public lands. And I mean, the place that I grew up in was fairly conservative. So if anybody was talking about these issues, they were usually talking about like, the term would be those damn enviros. They want to do all this stuff that doesn't make any sense. They're trying to lock people out of land. And that's what I grew up around. And then, found, this is not accurate at all. This isn't what people are proposing for public lands, and just really quickly became enthralled by what Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance stood for, the lands they were trying to protect, their vision for how Utah should treat its public lands, and was writing, I remember writing middle school reports on public lands protection, just really loved their work and thought that we needed more advocates to work on protecting public lands. So that was my dream in going to law school, was to learn how to be an effective advocate for public lands, for the environment. So I was fortunate enough to come back here and start working for SUA, Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, right off the bat. It was, there were a few bumps along the way, but got back here and worked with SUA for 10 years.
Wow. What were some of the highlights there? I mean, things you got to work on, kind of in summary.
So many. While I was there, we had a few big lawsuits that we succeeded in stopping some bad projects. We also, one thing I was proud of is we worked with two different oil and gas companies out in the Uinta Basin in areas that we cared about to work on and negotiate some compromises to help protect vulnerable lands. I'm
sure that has to do with a lot of, oil out there and kind of the friction that tends to lie between those two.
Right. I mean, that's the big oil and gas producing part of the state.
Yeah.
The last few years of my time there were largely spent working to negotiate a big public lands bill. The best way I can describe it is this was the bill that had to fail so that we could get Bears Ears National Monument. President Obama had made clear to the Utah congressional delegation that he was interested in doing what the tribes had asked. And this intertribal coalition of a number of different tribes that were asking the president to set aside Bears Ears National Monument. He had told Utah's congressional delegation, tribes want me to do this, I'm very inclined to do it, but I'll give you space and time to see if you can figure this out, see if you can put together legislatively a package for this area. And the delegation ultimately didn't succeed. And that's, part of, like I said, that was part of one of the checklist items for us to get the monument, was that we had to have that opportunity. That was a meaningful experience to me, though, being engaged in those discussions. Certainly saw a lot of, it's shaped a lot of my thinking on political dynamics, in part why I think our political leadership is so bad on public lands. Really had a firsthand view of that when I was there, and has fed into a lot of what I'm trying to do with O2 Utah.
Yeah, I'm sure that's what I was going to ask and say is I bet that all set such a strong foundation, because obviously what you're doing a lot now is dealing with probably a lot of those same legislative bodies, a lot of those same processes, and a lot of those, conflicts that can arise, between legislation trying to get things done, people trying to keep their power, get reelected, and at the same time try to balance what the people they represent want. And so that's awesome that you were able to do that for 10 years. Kind of looking at that experience in hindsight and postmortem, that middle schooler you or that pre-law school you, if you could go back and talk to that person, what would you say to them about the experience and if it met those expectations that you had at the time?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I wouldn't say anything different. I'd say just keep at it. Sure. It was, I love that job. I love doing that work. I hear people talk about the Sunday scaries. Never once felt that when I was working at SUA. Like Sunday night would roll around and I'd think, oh, I have to go to work tomorrow. Great.
Sweet.
Yeah. It was always a joy to go into the office.
Do you still work with a lot of those people in SUA or kind of mostly?
Some, not enough. Eventually I reached a point where I felt like had some ideas and kind of feelings that I wanted to follow, and that it was time for me to go do that. So it was more bittersweet to leave SUA after 10 years than, some feeling of like, oh, I'm done, or I reached the end of my line here. It was kind of hard to step away just because I loved it so much. I loved everybody there to work with. I thought the issue was great. Yeah.
So you had these feelings of wanting to do something else and move on. So what was the next step after that?
Went back to school.
Ties
into your, yeah, exactly. I had to go finish high school again.
I don't know why I just pictured you waiting for the bus, just back to school.
Yeah, back to school. People I really admired that I thought were doing interesting things had either done business school or done similar type training, and the way they thought about problems or going about solving problems was really intriguing to me. Because law school, in contrast, law school and law is a very established formal way for addressing issues, addressing problems. And obviously there are great things about the law, but there are also some potential shortcomings. And having seen how other people approached big problems, I thought that I wanted to try something similar. So yeah, I went back to school, went to business school, moved to California for that. Because you also asked about my forays in and out of Salt Lake. So This was another one. In that 10-year period I mentioned briefly, I did spend a year working remotely from Canada, British Columbia, Victoria, British Columbia.
It's a pretty area.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Pacific Northwest. It was great.
Don't get me started about the Pacific Northwest. It's the only place that holds a candle to Utah, in my opinion. But yeah, I could talk about that for hours. So you realize, like, you're in your career, you see these you go to law school, you see the shortcomings in, let's call it, this whole process, legal system, and then you kind of see business as this other avenue to maybe like solve for these shortcomings that you found in law. How was that experience, and how did that build upon that foundation that you had with SUA and in law school previously? Yeah,
it was incredible. I thought that, like I said, after 10 years at SUA, there were kind of two main feelings and reasons why I wanted to set out to leave. One was I had my first child, and it really changed how I felt about climate change. I would say before that I was kind of worried about it. I thought it was a big issue, but then when I had a child, really became super concerned, and at one point pretty depressed, because I felt like it was one thing for me to mess up the world for myself, and another thing to do it for somebody else, and somebody else who was going to see even more of those impacts. And didn't think that I was doing enough to address that. So that was one compunction. And then the second that we've talked about, feeling like, yeah, it's probably time to make myself a little uncomfortable and go out and see some new and different things to figure out how I can be a more effective advocate. Those were really the two drivers in wanting to do it. And I found the business school experience, again, going back to law being established, law school, at the highest level, I think law school is about helping people understand how to avoid risk. Business school, on the other hand, is about identifying and figuring out ways to take advantage of risk, or to, it's a much different risk relationship.
Yeah.
That's kind of the two biggest differences, or that's the biggest difference, I feel like, between those two forms of education in a nutshell.
Yeah. I don't know why it comes to mind, but I almost imagine like some like Greek statue or something that like, they're always super symbolic, right? And it's almost like, I know that there is a statue of it, but it's like a spear in one hand and a shield in the other, where it's almost like your law school experience is the shield, and like almost like you kind of explain this like risk averseness and how to, face risk. And then on the business side, it's almost like this spear of saying, well, how do we take advantage of this? How do we be more like offensive or aggressive with it? So, in that experience, was your experience in business school a lot of, was any of your coursework or any of the professors you interacted with more specifically on your long-term aspirations, or was it a little bit more general than that?
Sometimes I felt like a foreigner in a strange land, because most people in going to business school, they were there. In the program I did in particular was designed for people that were a little bit older than traditional business school students, so we'd had more experience. We weren't executive MBAs. So these were kind of mid-career. It was the mid-career space, and some people were going just to kind of help them springboard in what they were doing, but a lot of people coming from spaces like finance, venture capital, banking, traditional kind of financial or business sectors. There weren't as many people in that space who were saying, I've come from environmental advocacy and I'm taking this flyer to see if this has anything for me to learn from.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say, I did end up taking, when I was in business school, I was about to say, there wasn't, a lot of coursework that was directly designed to help environmental advocates become more effective. But so much of it was really impactful. I think in particular, the courses that I took at the business school that had to do with interpersonal dynamics, social emotional learning, leadership, things that people would often describe as soft skills, found incredibly helpful. Thought that those courses in particular had a lot for me to learn from. Accounting, hope my accounting professor isn't listening still, like, why did I even have to take that? Was less enthused about some of those courses. There was, maybe one other one I'll flag that was a hard skill. I took a class called Measuring Impact, taught by this really interesting professor who's been on the forefront of a lot of research around, he's actually in the political science space, but Measuring Impact was essentially learning how to take this technique of randomized controlled trials and apply it to all kinds of different spaces that people might be in. And in terms of a hard skill and just thinking around, aside from my soft skill classes, that one was probably the most impactful, maybe the most impactful course I've taken of any of my scholastic career.
That's interesting, because... Go for it.
Oh, I was going to say, because I feel like at the end, I joke sometimes that the two big questions that are always swirling around are, existential for people and epistemological, which is how do we identify truth? What's true? What's real? And as silly as this sounds, randomized control trials. That basic thing you learned in school of, like, if you want to learn something, go out and do a test, go out and do an experiment, and you need to have a control. You need to have something that is essentially, not being manipulated by you. It's not being, this is how the world works when the question you're asking isn't applied to it, and then your treatment group. And it's certainly in our work here, we have implemented a number of randomized controlled trials, or we try and make the best approximation that we can for some of the work we do. It changed my mindset around, this is another thing that came out of business school. I feel like a lot of problems that come up, I don't know the answer, and I can guess, but I feel much more comfortable saying, like, I don't know the answer. Let's try something and see if this actually helps us understand this problem better, or let's just go out and do our best guess about how we can solve this and see if it works out, and to not be so worried about knowing the answer up front.
No, I like that a lot. And it kind of reminds me of kind of two things. Is one, my last job I had before I'm at now, we did, so I was doing consulting, but there's also an impact investing fund they were trying to get off the ground. And we were trying to work with these entrepreneurs all around the world, trying to solve all of these issues, these social development goals from the United Nations. And like the hardest thing is, like, we would have to put together these memos of, okay, so here's the dollar amount of impact that we're having. And it was always this issue of like, okay, so if we're, let's say, providing dialysis care to people with kidney failure in Mexico, how does that compare to a place in Africa that's providing natural gas via, what's it called? Oh my God, composting. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, well, how do we have a thesis where it's like, one is human lives, one is like farming, agricultural, and economic growth. But at the end of the day, anybody you talk to who's going to write a check wants to know what this check's going towards. And then also not only wanting to know the double bottom line, but also wanting to know what their return's going to be like, and if they're going to get, those green fuzzies on top of it. But then also second, what it reminds me of is, I feel like, and I'm someone who works, a lot in data, always has people coming to me asking for questions, sometimes very ambiguous. And like, I think the mature thing of a lot of things like that is to say, yeah, I don't know, because we don't know everything. And if someone thinks they always have an answer, then they're probably either lying or don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And it always takes me back to like the scientific method. It's so simple, but it works in 99% of things. It's like, oh, well, what about this? Be like, I don't know, but I have a hypothesis that this, and if we do this, then we can either accept or reject it. And if we do, like, it's something I remember learning in like middle school science, being like, well, this is stupid. What do you mean? I'm not going to be a scientist. And then now here I am just chuckling about my 7th grade science teacher, and turns out he was absolutely right. And
yeah, I went to my daughter's, it's funny you should say that. My daughter just finished 5th grade.
Shout out.
In the middle of the year. Yeah, congrats. Finished elementary school. She had a science fair. And I went to the science fair, and all the kids, their teachers have been working with them to say, let's ask basic questions. Like, and in their case, it was things like, which soccer ball will bounce the highest? Which surface allows a soccer ball to travel farther? Why do avalanches happen? Just these basic questions, and they literally sat down, did it just the way you described, had a hypothesis, experimented, and then they had to, make their observation and say, was I right? Was I wrong? If I was wrong, maybe why? And like, I was so excited. I was telling the kids, like, this is how it really works. Like, this is such a good skill. Remember this. And, they're probably all thinking like, you're weird. Like, no, none of this, in the same way it didn't sink in for us. Hopefully this younger generation, it'll stay with them. But yeah, the science fair, I was very excited about the scientific method for them.
Big science fair guy.
Yeah, exactly. Big science fair guy.
Oh, that's awesome. So you wrap up school in California. Do you stick around there at all, or is it kind of graduation and load up the van, we're going back to Utah?
Came back. I was trying to figure out, again, looking back, it seems like a much more clear path, but at the time, there was a lot more kind of feeling around in the dark. I did know in school that one of the big questions I was interested in and wanted and didn't feel like was being addressed, and if there was something that I wanted to create or try and work on, it was this issue of why, and I would say specifically, why are Republicans so bad, elected officials so bad on climate? Mm-hmm. America's in this was, and especially at the time, in this unique place of developed countries of having like a uniquely bad major party that most people were still, and some of me feels like, well, who cares? We shouldn't even ask them, recognizing the reality of science and what was happening with climate change. And, a lot of that I think could be laid at the feet of the Republican Party. And there are many efforts to work on climate. There are many efforts to work politically to pass bills. Side note, which I would say we're incredibly successful. I mean, the landscape for climate action is so different now than when I was in school and than it was 2 years ago. But I kept thinking, why is it that Republicans are so bad? And the environmental community isn't doing anything to address that, and specifically for 45% of the country where Republicans will only get elected. And one additional comment there is there are some groups out there saying, hey, we want to work on Republicans in the environment. I find them completely unsatisfying because basically it's saying, these groups say, we are Republicans who want to work on climate. And what we'll cheer people on for, what we'll be happy with, is if a Republican says that climate change is happening. And a good example of this is here in Utah, John Curtis, a representative, is kind of the poster child of this. He'll say that climate change is happening. He even formed a bipartisan climate caucus in Congress. I am not aware of and haven't seen anything that he's done or voted for meaningfully to address climate. And that's the part that I think is so unsatisfying about these current efforts with Republicans. It's basically like, here's a pat on the back for saying climate change is real. But then you can turn around and say that the way we're going to solve climate change is by developing more fossil fuels. That's literally what the Republicans in Utah say. Like, oh, I'm serious about climate, and the way we're going to solve it is more fossil fuels, American fossil fuels. Like, that's absurd. You should be laughed out of a room. Like, if there's a big problem, offer a reasonable or real solution, and none of them have. That was the issue that I wanted, that I kept thinking about when I was in business school. Why is that? Because I don't think, in these modern times, and again, I'm talking about some things that I think are very loaded and they have lots of cultural connotation, but I was thinking about them more in the way of, how do we solve that? How do we address the fact that Republicans in Congress in particular are so bad on climate? By my estimation, the best way to change where they were was in how corporate America interacts with Congress. Nobody's more effective at getting the legislation they want than these, like we talked about, the well-lobbied corporations. Maybe no better example than pharmaceutical industry that gets its way with both Republicans and Democrats. I mean, I think it's so astounding. I don't know if people remember these fights about a year ago, 2 years ago, there were fights over President Biden was proposing, among other things, that the government should be able to negotiate with drug manufacturers over the prices of drugs. I mean, they're a huge buyer. Usually when you buy a lot of things, you come in and say, like, I want a deal. Yeah. U.S. government is specifically, in many cases, prohibited from doing that because the pharmaceutical industry is such an effective lobbyist. They come up with all kinds of reasons. But at the end of the day, it's absurd. Every other major industrialized country allows their government to negotiate, and they get way better prices on drugs. During that time, Kyrsten Sinema, senator from Arizona, was basically, by my estimation, willing to lose her seat to defend the pharmaceutical industry, to defend values that they thought were just patently absurd, because I think the pharmaceutical industry was so effective at lobbying her and others, but she was the poster child for somebody who had really been persuaded by the message from the pharmaceutical industry. Again, looking at it just set aside, is that right or is that wrong? And I looked at that and said, there's an effective way to get legislators to do what you want. And it seemed to me that the key that the environmental community had really been missing with Republicans, and the way you change them is you had to participate in their elections. That's what all these corporations do. They donate money to help. The reason money is important is if you run for office, like when I ended up doing this, if you run for office, your biggest task is getting elected. And to get elected, you have to raise absurd amounts of money. You really do, because there's no other way to get your name out there. There's no other way to get in front of voters.
Especially in
It's
today's
not like,
world, like you like literally, it's crazy to me, especially like working in tech. There is a dollar amount to get in front of any person at any time. And like the more, like, I mean, obviously we like think historically of like this election process and getting your message out. It's like, oh yeah, let's go spend millions of dollars on TV ads. Every American in the 60s, 70s, and 80s is crowding around the TV during primetime hours, and that'll see it. And then now it's like we carry on these things in our pockets. We have these screens in front of us all the time that we work from, and all of a sudden it's just like, it's almost at this point just you don't even realize it, but you'll just see ad after ad after ad, and a million of those later, you realize like, oh wait, like I was talking to someone, I was like, oh hey, did you see that ad about this? And they're like, no. I'm like, oh well, I think they just paid $1 million for us to have this conversation. And so it's crazy to see how this kind of corollary effect between like technology and, I mean, ads and being able to put anything at any given space to this power effect that it has on legislation. And they like correlated and grown to this effect where, to your point, like this power dynamic has just kind of ballooned up more than we ever thought it was going to happen.
Yeah, let's stick with tech for a second. Campaigns and elections are to politicians what for tech your funding rounds are. Going and raising money. You have an idea, you have a concept, you have a technology. You've got to raise money to scale up, to let people know that exists, to find buyers, whatever it might be. It takes that funding so that you can expand to a larger audience so that you can actually succeed. And that's what elections are. And it is the best opportunity to actually change how a politician thinks about an issue. It's when politicians decide who their friends are, who they don't like. And I think that for too long in the climate space, the environmental space generally, we've felt like the power of our ideas should carry the day. In politics, sometimes that works, but clearly with climate, it wasn't working with Republicans. Mm-hmm. And elections, in my mind, were the way that we could change that. And, not to go too far down that road, we can talk about that more, because it's not just, throwing somebody out, because in certain places where Republicans get elected, like you see they're, no Democrat could ever beat them. So Right. It's not like you're going to run a Democrat against them, but you take advantage of the fact that they need help, they need assistance, that you could maybe have, Republican primaries, you could have one Republican beat a different Republican. But it's taking that approach that corporate America uses, their engagement with fundraising, with elections, to really start a relationship and create trust and build priorities. And that was the problem that I kept thinking about in business school, and felt like I wanted to, I didn't see that being done by the environmental community. I thought that we needed to, and was suspicious that if that was going to work, a place like Utah was one of the best places to go pilot that. Because any environmental issue we want to make progress on at the state level here means working with Republicans.
Totally.
And it meant that I'd have to test out, could a bunch of enviros, could people that were saying climate change is the key problem of our time, could we show up in these really, Republican strongholds like Utah County and Davis County and work with Republican legislators to get them to do good legislation to address problems. So I had that in my mind, was thinking about it, and that was big part of what brought me back to Utah.
Totally. And that's one thing I really do love about Utah. And I think the pandemic brought it front of mind to me because, I mean, flashback to 2020, 2021, we have, I mean, the pandemic. We see politics get so much more power and how they're dealing with everything and kind of all these checks and balances. And I was super grateful. And I think we saw this both on a local scale and on a broad national scale, but these liberal cities and conservative states started to have almost like these internal checks and balances. So you had these far right ideas and methodologies start to pull. Then you have these far left ideologies start to pull, and it kind of met in the middle better than a lot of other situations. That's why you have, I mean, Salt Lake grow a ton. You had, I mean, Nashville, Charleston, like all of these places start to have this more and see this economic growth as people can kind of grow to everywhere. And I think to your point where when these places where there's been this gridlock where it's like, hey, if you're not a Republican, then we're not going to do any, I mean, nothing's going to get done. Nothing's going to get by, especially in these topics that are so relevant. But especially in Salt Lake, where we see this population of Salt Lake growing so much compared to these other areas, and all of a sudden this like quote liberal voice is starting to become so much more of a voice, and people have to start paying attention and give more credence to that. And so you're in California Business School, you see these issues that you want to solve. Is this when you started O2 Utah? Are you still in your development stage?
No, so I had been thinking about that and felt like that was a problem I wanted to work on. But then there was a little deviation first. I decided while I was in school that I also wanted to come back and run for mayor of Salt Lake City.
I forgot that story.
Yeah, so I knew at the time two things. One, we had a mayor who seemed to be unpopular. Just because anytime I talked to somebody from back home, they would bring that up. Not prompted by me. Like people just kept saying like, ugh, this mayor. And I thought that's interesting. Like clearly there's some high level of dissatisfaction. And then second, while I was in California, Trump was elected. And one of the first things he did was pull us out of the Paris Climate Accords. So it felt like super low time for climate work. And I was reading these stories while I was in California in national media about how the states and cities were picking up the slack. And routinely they kept mentioning Salt Lake as one of the places doing that. And I, again, thought that was interesting. Salt Lake had this national platform to show that it was working on climate change. Now, the specific policies that Salt Lake was pursuing, I didn't think were very... I didn't think it was real climate action. I thought they were getting credit for it, but it wasn't a very adventurous or brave policy. Well, no, it was the city had said that it wanted 100% clean electricity by 2032. But my time in California at Stanford, which was really kind of the center for clean energy and for climate work, it became apparent to me that clean energy would be achievable way before that, this was... I think people are now starting to understand that clean energy, when the sun's available and when the wind is blowing, it is now here in our area the cheapest way to produce electricity. It's cheaper than
it's
coal.
Like down to the dollar per kilowatt.
It's cheaper free. Than natural gas, and I didn't think people understood that, and so just saw like things are really going to change on this front. Somebody could run for mayor of Salt Lake and have a platform to talk about climate, to push bolder policies, and actually have that disseminated to a much larger audience than just the city, than just Utah. So decided that I wanted to run for mayor. I also felt like, hey, this will be a good, the same way we were talking about the scientific method and just experimenting. I thought it'll be interesting. I probably won't win, but I'll get an opportunity to raise an issue, and I will also likely learn a lot from the experience, which definitely turned out to be the case on both fronts.
What were some of the takeaways from that election process that then fueled, work you did down the road?
Oh, it was so formative. We talked about, I had the suspicion that elections were important. Then when I ran as a candidate, I realized this is absurd how important elections are.
Talk about validating a hypothesis.
Yeah, most of my task running for mayor of Salt Lake, in the state of Utah, I was eliminated at the primary stage. And here in the state, our race for mayor of Salt Lake is probably, outside of the governor's race, outside of federal races, so Congress, the House of Representatives or Senate, the county mayor's race here. Now some of the Salt Lake County-wide races are becoming a bit more expensive. But beyond that, this is probably, this is right there as one of the most expensive races in the state. What did that mean? That meant I had to spend all of my day on the phone pestering people, asking them if they'd donate to my campaign, which was such an eye-opening experience. One, super uncomfortable to just call up random people and strangers and say, hey, you don't know me or you barely know me, give me money. It was uncomfortable to call good friends and family and say, like, hey, give me money. But seeing how critical that was, and this in particular was, the huge thing for me, seeing that when you're just watching politics as a hobby, when you're armchairing politics, it's easy to say, like, I don't like these people, or I do like those people, or that's a dumb issue, or that's a dumb idea. When you're running and you need to raise absurd amounts of money and you encounter someone like that before you would have just, not given the time of day, all of a sudden you find yourself listening a lot more than you would because you need something from them. Yeah. And you can't get elected. You can't, especially in a competitive race like that, being kind of an elitist snob, frankly.
Yeah.
You have to build coalitions. You have to engage people outside of your immediate circle. And I found myself being way more intellectually flexible with issues. I found myself, having conversations with people that I probably wouldn't normally. And that to me was really a key takeaway from this. Like, oh yes, here's the time when I need to go out and get something. I need people's votes. I need their support. I need their money. So yeah, I'm going to do things. I'm going to accommodate them so that I can ultimately get into office and do the things that I want. And that was such an eye-opening experience to me from running for office. In addition to the other thing I'd say is before that, I came from a policy background. Policy background's like thinking deeply about a problem and trying to figure out different ways to solve it. That's not elections. Elections are show. Elections are conveying information to people in a really quick fashion about what you'd like to do, what your disposition is, why they should come to your side. And, trying to convey on a campaign the very nitty-gritty way that you go about trying to get clean energy for Salt Lake, that's not necessarily a campaign issue. Like on campaigns, campaigns you have to convey to people quickly, I want to tackle climate change. This is a key issue for me. I want to tackle homelessness. This is a key issue for me. And you have to figure out ways to convey that information quickly. And so that was also a big learning experience. I felt like maybe the last week of my campaign, I started to get a hang of it a little bit more. But of course, by then, way too late, right? But that's another thing, people that run for the first time usually mess it up. They usually do it wrong. Probably most of the time they lose. And I knew that going in, but it was a huge learning experience to do that.
That's awesome. Because there's one thing I've learned like recently in life is very few things are taught and usually have to be learned. And I feel like that's a great example of it. Like you could sit down with anybody and they could say, oh yeah, elections are tough. You have to meet with a lot of different people. You have to be able to convey different messages to different people and essentially like get a check from them. But until you are in that seat and understanding it, it's a whole different perspective and an experience that I'm sure just only, fueled kind of what you're doing now and gave you that comfortability and that experience to help you be more successful where you are now.
Yeah. No, I'm really grateful that I did it because it was I would describe it as one of my most successful failures.
I love that term, successful failures. Because that's one thing that even me, like I know that in order to succeed, you have to fail and fail and fail and fail and fail and fail and learn and learn and learn and learn. But very few people talk about, be like, oh, this failure is what gave me my success or gave me what I needed to learn in order to do so. And sometimes we think so like myopically about it that we just look at this failure that's on our lap at the moment and can't process that or get through it to the point to force forward and to kind of what we're more called to be or what we do need to learn in order to take those next steps forward. So I like that successful failure, most successful failure. So you have this quote successful failure from being a mayor. You have this experience, I mean, talking with, I mean, important people, powerful people, I mean, having success in getting checks from these people that seemed so daunting at the time. And then you took that experience from running for mayor and pivoted into kind of an adjacent way with, I would assume, O2 Utah at this point.
Yeah. So after that, took a little time to decompress, but it was clear to me there was a lot of promise behind my idea that elections meant something. And now I had gone through the experience of running for office, and I felt like I saw, okay, not only is this an incredible leverage point, but I've learned some of the issues that or some of the realities of running a campaign, and how if there were an organization that came in and started working with politicians when they were running for office, how we could add value to their campaigns, how we could take advantage of campaigns to push the issues that we wanted to push. And at that point, decided to start O2 Utah. And the whole goal was to make an impact on specifically air quality and climate issues here at the state level, working with the legislature. But what we were going to do different was show up during elections, both in Republican districts, Democratic districts, swing districts, and take advantage of that time period to start building relationships, cultivate those relationships, and then give policymakers specific policy that we wanted them to implement.
Yeah. And before your mayor experience, would you have gone into O2 with the idea that the way to make an impact is sitting in these legislative sessions and doing that, compared to like the initial race and fundraising and all of that?
I think just because I had keyed in on elections, I would have started with elections, but I wouldn't have understood why elections mattered. I wouldn't have understood how to effectively push in elections, how to effectively work to try and persuade people that were running to work on our issues, had I not done that. But that's a great question, because that learning experience from running and failing was so valuable in creating O2 Utah. It really had shaped, how I do this now. It just would not be the same had I not gone through that.
Awesome. No, I love that. And I mean, I guess let's kind of focus on kind of O2 Utah, what you're working on today, and kind of the current landscape of what you're doing in Utah, because I mean, only within the past couple of years have there gotten a ton of, national exposure to, Salt Lake and Utah and some of the threats of climate. And I think there's a lot more ears perked up to it. But unfortunately, at the same time, I feel like we're so plagued by all of these things trying to get our attention of almost existential crises, or this is the biggest issue, that we almost grow numb to it. So if I see someone say, oh my gosh, did you hear about this? I'll be like, oh, aliens? Like, we got to the point now where we are like unfazed that the government has said aliens are real and we have evidence. And people are like, cool. Anyway, do you see this reel? Do you see this TikTok? And it's wild to me, because like I'll never forget when I think I was in Washington actually, and I read the New York Times article that they had about the Great Salt Lake levels going down, listening to the podcast that they put out. And it's a lot of very strong language. And like, not only that, but there's, examples and receipts of, I can't remember the name of the lake that essentially happened to in California, where their lake went dry, those same sort of heavy metals at the riverbed, and the dust came up, and all of a sudden the city's gone because no one can live there. And now it's almost paints this picture of, oh, we love Salt Lake, but how much do you love wearing a gas mask every time you go out, because these winds will blow up and here's all these metals. And we see these solutions, but they're kind of, quote solutions, unquote, but kind of would love to hear a little bit more about, because some of maybe the more tactical things that you're working on, key priorities that you're focused on.
Just because pushing legislation, making change is difficult, and we're young, we've really tried to stay focused on pushing ambitious air quality legislation. The great thing about air is that you get kind of 2 for 1 with that. most of the things we do to improve our air quality have a similar impact on our carbon emissions. So we've stayed focused on that. Certainly I'm watching what's happening with the Great Salt Lake, and where we can, we try and talk to policymakers about that. But what I've seen is that to get good policy, the policy itself is about 5% of your work. 5%. 95% is building relationships with policymakers. It's, frankly, I talked about money for politicians, but I have a team here that is doing this full time. That doesn't happen unless I raise money and pay them a salary. And as I think unromantic as it sounds, that's really a key part of advocacy and making change is money. Again, fundraising. We're dealing with a collective action problem. This is what we talked about. Everybody benefits from clean air, but who's paying money so that we can have our own lobbyists, so that we can show up and compete in the same space as all these corporations that don't want the state to do anything about our pollution problem? So that's a key part of it. It just takes a lot of work. There's so much that the policy itself is that little tip of the iceberg above water. The body of the iceberg are things like that. The time that we've spent in elections, the time that we've spent raising money, the time that we've spent going through the channels that legislators want for you to be able to come in and talk to them about issues. And there's a lot behind it. With O2, maybe to make that more concrete, essentially for our first 2 years, I felt like our main task was just to be consequential enough in elections that we'd even matter. Like when I say showing up and helping in elections, you have to bring time, you have to bring resources, you have to bring knowledge, you have to bring money to help, and that doesn't happen overnight. And really, before we could work on any policy, we really had to be showing up in elections, helping people when they were running for office, really for 2 years before we could even turn to pushing any policy.
No, I like that. And it's like, it kind of reminds me of really sports. I guess the first place my brain went to is like, you watch the Jazz play. A game itself is that 5%, but showing up every day in the gym and shooting free throws and running drills, like that is that 95%. And for you, it's like, okay, well, if I'm going to pay my staff, if I'm going to make an impact, I got to go hit the phones. I got to go talk to all these people. I got to develop these relationships. During that process, and obviously it dovetails well with your mayoral race experience, of what were some of those popular talk tracks or, issues that you would bring up that would give you the most success?
Now or when I was running for mayor?
Maybe both.
When I was running for mayor, there were a few different issues that I was talking about and highlighting, but I think the one that tended to resonate the most with my supporters was how I approached air quality. And, here's a great learning experience for me, again, coming from a policy background on air quality. When I was running for mayor, I talked about kind of 3 steps I thought that the city should take. The least consequential in terms of actually reducing air pollution was that I wanted the city to start a process to try and move the refinery on the north end of town. It's a big polluter, but moving any one company
and we're talking specifically about like Beck Street.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. I thought the city should work to get that out of Salt Lake City. I still feel that way. I think it's a terrible idea. In terms of actual pollution reduction, though, that's a drop in the bucket. That's one thing that has to happen. It's not the biggest thing. But out on the campaign trail, when I would say I think we should move the refinery, there was nothing that spoke to people more strongly than that, even though I felt like the impact was limited. And that's kind of where I learned about the difference between elections and policy. And I think a lot of that came because everybody can understand that. The refinery is in your face. People see it. People understand that here's a business that's making money by just dumping its waste on residents, and that's not right. It's not. And, the rest of our system operates as like, oh, you're okay. You got this permit. You can dump it. But like, what if you, at your house, you decided that when you went to throw your garbage out every day, you were going to throw half of it in your garbage can and the other half into your neighbor's yard? You'd feel ashamed of yourself. Anyone should. But for that refinery, that's what they do on a daily basis. And that's what it communicated to people. They weren't people weren't taking the time to sit down and like measure out every ounce of pollution that was coming out of the refinery and say, well, that will get us some part of the way. But boy, what you should be proposing is everyone have an electric car. What you should be proposing is this. That spoke to people. And that issue, that was an eye-opener to me to see that, like communicating important ideas to people through what you talk to them about. And so air quality was the one that I saw resonated the most with people. Because I was also talking about things like I wanted the city to get to 100% clean electricity by 2023. And that was the one that I was the most energized by. I thought that was the one that we could accomplish most quickly, that would have the biggest impact on our carbon emissions. But I don't think it resonated with people as strongly as my proposal that we move the refinery. So there, on communication, I learned about, I saw that air quality tended to land well with the people who were my supporters and who voted for me. And I think that also helped them to understand how serious I was about air quality. And because, running in Salt Lake City, every mayoral candidate is going to talk about air quality. Everybody's going to say like, oh, I want to do something about this.
Because I feel like it's one of those things where, going back to our example of risk, one of the prime ways to calculate risk is exposure times impact. And if you think about every Utah, especially in the Wasatch Front, like if you bring up air quality in the winter, everybody has an opinion, everybody rolls their eyes, everybody wants a solution. And so I feel like that is something that resonates so much compared to let's keep using the example of the refineries on Beck Street. I grew up, so we grew up in the Avenues. Mm-hmm. My grandparents lived in North Salt Lake. So we would always do that drive around 11th Ave, around City Creek, down Beck Street and over. And every single time I'd be like, oh, well, that's kind of like, it's just very like the strong juxtaposition of this neighborhood, literally right there, one of the most populous in Salt Lake proper. And then all of a sudden there's this refinery right here. I remember there was one time where, so my mom's a big runner and I don't remember why she did this. In hindsight, it was kind of dumb. But she's like, I'm going to run to our grandparents' house today when we go to this family dinner. And I had been younger than 10. So I was like, okay, Mom, you run every day. Who cares? Mm-hmm. And she called us because I guess she had a cell phone then because that's the only way. But she's like, I'm on Beck Street.
Payphone, man.
You have a collect call from Mom.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And she's like, come pick me up. My lungs are dying. I can't do this. And that was the first real contextual experience that I can put my finger on of bad air, person I know who can run very well and shouldn't have an issue is having an issue. I don't think this is good. Yeah. And so I think, to that point, it's something that resonates with so many people and people want a solution, but then you start throwing them some of the solutions. I think one thing that in particular that's keeping us from being this middle ground, tertiary city, secondary city in the US to really growing to be a primary hub is public transportation. Mm-hmm. Trax is fine. If you use it, the time it takes to take Trax between driving is so big that there's no way. I had for a lot of the beginning of 2022 and in late 2021, I lived across the street from a front runner station and was working down in Lehigh. And I was like, hey, if I just get an electric scooter, I can hop on the train, work on the train, get off the train, have a fun little scooter ride where I'm jamming out to music for 10 minutes, go to the office, and then do the same. So I net was wasting 40 minutes less a day. It was being productive because I could work on the train. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I felt like I was actually doing my own part to fix it. But at the same time, that doesn't work for a lot of people. Bus system here is not as reliable as we'd like. Trax isn't as fast as we'd like. And a lot of, just things that would keep people from that. If you poll people today of their propensity to use public transportation, be very low. Mm-hmm. However, I do think there is a huge opportunity in Utah for e-bikes. Mm-hmm. Because, I lived in Seattle for a time where, very walkable city, especially if you're living in the city. And then they have their train system, which works pretty well. They have a really good bus system, so it's easy to get around. But then like here, I mean, Salt Lake is spread out enough where, I mean, obviously you can't walk, especially, I mean, just thinking about Salt Lake proper and like kind of the main hubs of like Sugar House and downtown. And I think it's like, even like the rising like Maven districts and over in, Marmalade district, like that's still very far apart. And like, there's no easy way publicly to do so. But then we have this like idea of e-bikes where it's like, oh, cool. It's kind of like a bike. Well, it's like, you can cover about the same distance as you can as a car with minimal effort pretty easily.
Yeah.
And without having that huge sacrifice of time. And so, but it's like that, I mean, the consumer behavior you would have to change to get people to buy e-bikes would be wild compared to, again, like these narratives of like, hey, here's this refinery that's blowing all of this smoke into here. It's very contextual for people and doesn't necessarily cause a huge personal habit change compared to moving a factory.
Yeah, I mean, you gave me this heads up beforehand. You want to talk about what are some things that I thought the city could do better, what would make Salt Lake better. And I think you've hit the nail on the head for one of the key issues is the way that we get around. And I just don't think a community that's based on cars is ever as good as a community that you can get out and move around by public transportation, especially by walking or being on a bike. Everywhere that I've visited, everywhere that I've lived, that issue is, I feel like, one of the closest connectors to how much I enjoy living there. Like, am I dependent on a car? Is the only way that I can go see a friend to get in a car, the only way that I can get to the grocery store, a car? Like, I've found I don't like those communities as much as the ones that you feel like you have a neighborhood and you can get around. And I do think, yeah, Salt Lake City, one of the key issues we need is better being able to get around the city in a better fashion than in a car. And I actually, on this one, I think in particular, it's about infrastructure. One of the keys is infrastructure. I ride my bike a lot, and when I was working at SUA, typically got to work. I was living in Sugar House, got to work by bike, just a standard bike. And I was out there, but it's, I guess for me, the thing I realized is I recently got an e-bike to transport my girls, two girls. When I was riding around on a bike, I was worried about cars, I was worried about traffic, but I'd ride pretty much any road in the city. Now that I have my kids on my back, I'm very aware, much more aware of what's going on with cars, what routes I will take. Most of our streets are not friendly for bikes. They're not safe for bikes. I mean, sure, if you're a dude in your 30s and you're willing to like ride in and out of traffic, yeah, you can ride anywhere. That's not how we're going to get people on the streets. No. Like, you need streets that are safe for kids to ride on. And we don't have that in many places. And it's really about, we've invested and prioritized. Our infrastructure is investing in and designed to move people around in cars. And that's how people move around. I think if you spend time on things like the S-Line or now some of these new bike trails that have popped up, all of a sudden you see, they get use. Like, once you have a place that anybody can go and feel comfortable moving along, and it's actually really pleasant, they get used. And we don't have that in many places of the city. And I think that's probably, one of the key things we need to add, because especially with e-bikes, I think we'll see a much larger audience using a much more diverse and wider array of people using e-bikes to get around. But our infrastructure isn't there to make it safe, to make it to invite bikes, to prioritize bikes, prioritize walking, prioritize methods of getting around the city that aren't individual cars.
Totally. And it's like, and I think it's so primed for it as well, because over in the past, let's throw out a number of 10 years, at least in my experience, I feel like people have become a lot more bike friendly in general. Road biking, I feel like, has become a lot more popular. A lot more people are getting into mountain biking. So it's like, hey, you have this bike as, a hobby, a recreation. Now let's kind of pivot it a little bit and also be this way of commuting in such a way. And like, into your point of like cities you've lived in where it makes you enjoy more and happiness of life. You're getting more exercise, which, we don't have to get into details of the correlation of exercise and happiness, but then you get to experience your community more, because instead of being in this box where you probably have something playing in the background, you're actually hearing the people talk. You're hearing the wind blow in the trees and seeing all of the actual things, which gives a better experience in general as well. And so, yeah, I love the way that you hit that, because like when I was in Seattle, I didn't have a car. I mean, walked most places. I mean, they had a lot of really good bike and scooter rentals, so I would do that. Worst case scenario, I'm taking an Uber. But yeah, I like that. And I mean, I think that's a kind of theme in general that I'm realizing in life is community. The more community that we can have, and there's like a lot of changes in Utah and Salt Lake in general of how we're thinking about communities and how people want to have a community. And I think the more opportunity we have to be exposed to people and that community, the better off everyone will be. And what better way than, for a cause is cleaning up our air, which again, everybody has some sort of experience with and a pretty strong opinion to. Mm-hmm. So on top of kind of like the way we get around and the way our infrastructure works, what are some of these other key things that you think need to change in order to get our air quality or get our city environmentally where we need to be?
I think 3 of the key issues for Salt Lake City to be a better city in the future. One is, yes, transportation, how we get around, having it be safe for people on foot and on bike, even more public transportation options. That's a key. Air quality is another one, because it's one of the biggest detriments about living here. I think a third is the cost of housing. Mm-hmm. The city is unaffordable, and I think there are a lot of things that go along with housing. Areas that become more and more expensive. I think about, I was recently living in South Salt Lake for a little while, which is much less expensive. There is so much more, a place where a wider array of people can live, a wider array of people can afford to open new businesses. Just take, I think a good measure on this front is restaurants. Salt Lake has some great restaurants. We've got, the really high-end restaurants. We don't have, as compared to South Salt Lake, in the neighborhood I'm in now in Marmalade, we don't have anywhere near the availability and diversity of ethnic food that South Salt Lake did, because it's really expensive to try. If you're going to take a flyer and open a restaurant, like South Salt Lake is a much cheaper option than Salt Lake. And we miss out on a lot of things because we've become so unaffordable. It is also something that, Salt Lake essentially chases away people who are younger, starting families, looking to buy their first home. You can't do that in Salt Lake. And I remember this when I was running for mayor, we had this big gap in population. My estimation, you'd see essentially this huge crowd of 20-year-olds, early 30-year-olds, people who were coming here after school, could afford an apartment because they were living there with 3 other people, right? You were splitting rent that way. And so we had a relatively big population. And then we had this big population of people in their late 50s and older, and this gap in between. Like, people really couldn't start families here. And this was before things got especially bad. So we're missing out. We're chasing people out of our city, missing out on opportunities because it's so expensive.
Yeah, especially when you think about the future. I don't know why Japan comes to mind the most, but like their birth rates are so low. And the biggest thing for them is like, oh, well, we won't be able to take care of our elderly because we don't have this population to support it. And in the same way, if we want to continue this economic growth, and this continual forge of like Salt Lake being more of a bigger dot on the map than it was, like we have to continually try to draw people of all sorts of ages and backgrounds, and especially priming the beginning of the funnel of like the youth and getting there as well and supporting those families. Because obviously there's the bill that passed that gave $20,000 to first-time home owners for new builds. But at the same time, to your point, it's like, oh, so you want me to go all the way to Harriman? You want me to go like essentially away from anywhere that it's probably more of a personal opinion than most, but like I don't want to go live in a place that I don't necessarily want to live in just because there's like a financial incentive. I want to be able to be where I want to be and have an option to be there. And like totally. And I think my experience in Seattle has done something similar, and it kind of correlates the two between public transportation and affordable housing. Because like in Utah, up until 4 years ago, you could buy a house in Salt Lake pretty reasonably most places. And then now it's gotten so ridiculous. And then interest rates now, even if prices do come down a little bit, still doesn't make any sense. And with Seattle, obviously with Salt Lake, we're geographically restrained by the mountains, by the lake, et cetera. And it's very similar to Seattle where, mean, Seattle itself is formed on a peninsula and then kind of another peninsula. And so, I mean, obviously you can't build houses in water. Actually, you can there on South Lake Union. There's literally houseboats you can buy. But the only way to solve that is better transportation. So if you are living outside, a better way to get in, which I feel like Frontrunner and some of those things do a better job about, but at the same time, intercity stuff is a lot more difficult. So it's funny how like you start pulling on one thread of one issue and it starts to correlate to the other, and it all ends up being this kind of giant tangled ball of yarn that's, I mean, complicated, but at the same time, we're motivated and getting more motivated to tackle some of these issues more and be a little bit more aggressive.
Yeah, I think that the cost of housing is complex, and with a city like Salt Lake that's such an economic engine and an attractive place to live, you're always going to see higher costs there than other places. But I'm also suspicious that the way we go about permitting new construction, the restrictions that we place, we are a big part of the problem. We're making things be more expensive than they have to be. And, again, I would point to political dynamics, and especially I'd think about how elections happen. The fact that Salt Lake City, one very small part, this is certainly not the key thing that we need to do, accessory dwelling units, these little mother-in-law apartments that people can add in the back or, build in a garage or above a garage. Still really hard to do in Salt Lake. And I think at the city level, they've gotten hung up on issues like, well, we need to, people are worried about having to compete for parking out on their street. And so because of that, we're not going to do in certain neighborhoods, we're not going to add accessory dwelling units. I think that's kind of an excuse, but the fact that it's more important that we have super convenience for our cars than that we have affordable housing for people. And we've decided that that's a more important issue than adding as much housing as quickly as we can to address the lack of affordability here in the city.
Cool. Talk about the bill that you recently passed to help with the bromine levels and how it's going to make an impact on Salt Lake citizens.
Yeah, so we had in our legislation a proposal that the state of Utah should start regulating bromine pollution because, again, I said this was a really unique Utah problem. Federally, there isn't a standard for bromine emissions in the air. There isn't a standard at the state level because people didn't know that this was such an issue for pollution. And also, it's really not likely to be a problem in many other places than here on the Wasatch Front, where we happen to have this company that's processing salt water. So one of the few places you'd find bromine, combined with this these meteorological conditions where, as we know in the winter, you get these conditions where we don't have storms coming in or out. You just have this massive air that kind of parks itself over the Wasatch Front and doesn't really let anything out. Because of that super unique situation, so nobody was regulating bromine. We had new research saying it was really impactful for our pollution levels. So our legislation basically said this is something we should limit and work to reduce because that wasn't, it's not, the state wasn't doing anything about it. And the bill we passed does that, creates a pathway for the state of Utah to create a standard, start limiting this pollutant, start reducing it so that, we're tackling something that in worst case scenario, like I said, is making our wintertime pollution spikes 10 to 25% worse than they would be.
Yeah. And it's like you said, like the Beck Street, removing that refinery, like maybe 5% impact. But this, especially when you think about, again, the risk calculation being impact versus exposure, when you have these high levels of bromine in a place where it's going to sit there for a long amount of time based on how the city sits in the mountains and the weather patterns, like it's a pretty bad situation for us, especially in our quality of life and our health correlates to all of that. So, so thinking about the line between, either your middle school self of dreaming to work at SUA and work on these environmental processes and starting or being in the mayoral race and starting O2 Utah to getting to this place where you pass legislation. What was that feeling like? Kind of feeling like you were one step of making your dreams come true.
It's still kind of, it's really changed how I've thought about whether or not this whole pathway, this whole idea of let's use elections to try and clean our air. Let's use this corporate lobby approach to try and do something about climate. Like, I feel like, yeah, we saw promise. We passed a bill that, again, the ceiling of this, if we can address this pollutant, if this legislation plays out the way we hope it does, we're talking about, again, a pollutant that's making air quality here 10 to 25% worse. I don't think there's anything that I've seen from the legislature in the last few decades that even comes close to such a potential for significant reduction. So it's there's a little bit of shock, like, oh yeah, it actually worked. Actually, we got something through, and all that hard work paid off. I think we moved on to very much an idea of like, how do we build on this? What's next? We've got a lot of ideas. Now we've got to start implementing. We have to take what we learned in that process, which was how we engage with legislators, how you start working on legislation, and build on that to do even more. So that's how we've moved forward on this thought, thinking, let's take advantage of what we learned to do even more. And certainly let's take this out to people and say, hey, come help us with your support, with your donations, with you showing up, with you reaching out to policymakers. Look, we've seen promise, we've seen potential. Come join us, help us continue to make a difference.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, kudos to you for getting that done. I mean, we're all going to benefit from it. I mean, especially like you said, before you went to business school, you now had this daughter and like wanted the future for her to be brighter, and is so much more relevant for you because, I mean, your life is your life, but to pass it on to someone you love, and hand them this, I mean, burning house, and say, enjoy your inheritance, compared to saying, hey, like, we're going to take care of this house that we have, this city that we love, and move forward. So congrats to all your success you're having, and I love that you're happy with the success you've had, but really motivated to keep moving forward and keep, I mean, pushing for these issues that you're so passionate about, and a lot of people around here are. So thinking about, I mean, the future, I mean, what keeps you here? I mean, I know if there's something I know about David, it's if I ask him, what are you up to this weekend, or you have any travel plans, I will soon, within the next 10 minutes, learn about an obscure part of Utah that I didn't even know existed. So I know outdoors is a big part of that for you, and forming those experiences with your family. Yeah, I mean,
my family and friends here are such an important part of my life, and that's one of the great things about being here, is having that network. Brings me a lot of happiness and a lot of joy. So that's a key thing. The people that I know and love here, part of what keeps me here. Another big part, is the outdoors and being in one of the most incredible places really in the world, both for an impressive geography, but also the amazing thing we have is that so close to us are just vast amounts of public lands we all own, lands that you can essentially go anywhere, explore anything, go visit these places. And it's so few people have such an incredible ability to get out here. That is one of the key things that keeps me here. And yeah, I love to go out and just explore public lands, go camp, visit random corners of the state, especially, the less visited, the less I know about it, the better, because it's an opportunity to go to see something new. I have continued skiing. I moved from mainly resort skiing to mostly backcountry skiing and splitboarding. My opinion, the best activity ever invented by humans, I will say.
Splitboarding?
And backcountry skiing, yeah. Backcountry skiing, splitboarding, it's the pinnacle. It's the gold standard. There's nothing better. It is the pinnacle of human movement and human recreation. That in the winter, yeah, it's that there's nothing I would rather do than be out exploring a new place in the backcountry. We have some of the best snow in the world, some of the best access in the world, so it's a great place to be for that. That kind of takes all of my focus in the winter. Dabble a little bit in climbing. Also love backpacking, rafting, like taking my girls out to some of the rivers here in the States. So that wealth of outdoor access and opportunities in Utah is pretty tough to beat.
What are maybe your favorite 3 or 4 places that you've been in Utah? Bonus points if it's more obscure.
Boy, that's hard to answer. I have so many favorite places. Just, I would say the last year, some places that I've visited that I've really enjoyed. Some skiing in both the Stansbury Range and the Pilot Range have been great. I've really tried to and loved getting out to more of Utah's Great Basin and West Desert, because there's so many spaces there that just don't get visited at all, and it's got its own beauty, its own unique environments. I don't want to give away all my secrets.
Can't give them all. You can't give away your spots.
But that's it. Yeah, at a high level, those are 2 places I'll flag. You know, southern Utah, the Colorado Plateau is absolutely incredible. There's so many incredible places. Hard to, name just one.
Totally. So we'll wrap up with 2 questions. First question is, if you could invite someone to be on the Small Lake City podcast to interview and hear their story, who would you want to hear from?
Boy, that's a good question. I think someone worth talking to who's pretty interesting, Dustin Buckthal. He started and has been building his empire at the Front climbing gym.
True.
And pretty incredible. I mean, I went from a grad student who kind of on the side went in on a small little bouldering gym, and now has built these incredible climbing gyms, is expanding, is, building climbing walls now around the country, building climbing holds, is kind of creating a construction company as well on the side. So pretty dynamic story that I've watched a lot of. Like way back in the day, had a pass to the Front when it was just this little bouldering gym.
Now it's a madhouse during
rush
hour,
and multiple, and he's built this whole empire, and it's pretty impressive.
No, I love that. And then lastly, if people want to find out more about O2 Utah or donate or follow you on social media, where do they find you?
Yeah, the website, o2utah.org. We're on the socials, how to do that. Again, O2 Utah. But sure, love people to come get involved. They really do make a difference. I know these problems that we've talked about, like air quality and climate, I know that's on a lot of people's minds right now, watching this record heat across the world, and can be pretty depressing. And I hear you. I felt it. The same thing. I think an antidote to that is get involved, and you do make a difference. Again, I've seen firsthand, so few legislators are hearing from people that they need to do something about air. They need to do something about climate. So if you're concerned about those things, get involved. We'll help you make a difference.
Yeah. Check out the website. I mean, donate if you can, volunteer if you can. I know it's a lot of things that we all are passionate about, is protecting this valley and protecting our health at the same time, and making sure it's here for generations to come, and our kids and our kids' kids continue to be the place that we want it to be. But we have to protect it and maintain it in order to do so.
Yeah.
So I mean, thanks, David, for coming on, and excited to keep watching all the fun work that you're doing.
Eric, thanks for having me. I had a great conversation. I've enjoyed this.
Absolutely. Likewise.